Hello everyone, and welcome. Today we begin a long series. A series of reading the work of Sir Thomas Malory, King Arthur, and the Knights of the Round Table. Now, of course, if you like this sort of stuff, give it a like and subscribe. And you click the bell so you can know when part 2 comes out. It's quite a long work, so we're not going to do the whole thing all at once. But today we begin. So, with that in mind, let's embark on the quest, should you choose to accept it. We now begin King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, beginning with the first chapter, the coming of Arthur and the founding of the Round Table. 1. Merlin foretells the birth of Arthur. King Vortigern the usurper sat upon his throne in London, when suddenly, upon a certain day, ran in a breathless messenger, and cried aloud, "Arise, Lord King, for the enemy has come, even Ambrosius and Uther, upon whose throne thou sittest, and full 20,000 with them. And they have sworn by a great oath, Lord, to slay thee, ere this year be done. And even now they march towards thee, as the wind of north of winter, for bitterness and haste." At those words, Vortigern's face grew white as ash, and, rising in confusion and disorder, he sent for all the best artificers and craftsmen and mechanics, and commanded them vehemently to go and build him straightway in the furthest west of his lands a great and strong castle, where he might fly for refuge and escape the vengeance of his master's sons. "And moreover," cried he, "let the work be done within 100 days from now, or I will surely spare no life amongst you all." Then all the host of craftsmen, fearing for their lives of course, found out a proper site whereupon to build the tower, and eagerly began to lay the foundations. But no sooner were the walls raised up above the ground, than all of their work was overwhelmed, and broken down by night invisibly, no man perceiving how, or by whom, or maybe what. And the same thing happening again, and yet again, all the workmen, full with terror, sought out the king, and threw themselves upon their faces before him, beseeching him to interfere and help them, or to deliver them from their dreadful task. Filled with mixed rage and fear, the king called for the astrologers and wizards, and took counsel with them from what these things might be, or how to overcome them. The wizards worked their spells and incantations, and in the end declared that nothing but the blood of a youth born without mortal father, smeared on the foundations of the castle, could avail to make it stand. Messengers were therefore sent forthwith through all the land to find, if it were possible, such a child. And as some of them went down a certain village street, they saw a band of lads fighting and quarrelling, and heard one of them shout, "Avaunt, thou imp! Avaunt! Son of no mortal man, go find thy father and leave us in peace." At that, the messengers looked steadfastly upon the lad, and asked who he was. One said that his name was Merlin, another that his birth and parentage were known by no man, a third that the foul fiend alone was his father. Hearing these things, the officers seized Merlin and carried him before the king by force. But no sooner was he brought to him than he asked in a loud voice, for what cause was he being dragged away? Vortigern answered, "My magicians, they told me to seek out a man that had no human father, and to sprinkle my castle with his blood, so that it may stand." Merlin looked perplexed. "Order those magicians to come before me, and I will convict them of a lie." The king was astonished at these words, but nevertheless commanded the magicians to come and sit down before Merlin, who cried out to them, "Because ye know not what it is that hinders the foundation of the castle, ye have advised my blood for a cement to it, as if that would avail. But tell me now rather what there is below that ground, for something there is surely underneath that will not suffer the tower to stand." The wizards at these words began to fear, and they made no answer. Then said Merlin to the king, "I pray, Lord, that workmen may be ordered to dig deep, deep down into the ground, till they shall come to a great pool of water." This then was done, and the pool discovered far beneath the surface of the ground. Then turning again to the magicians, Merlin said, "Tell me now, you false sycophants, what there is underneath that pool." But they were silent. Then he said to the king, "Command this pool to be drained, and at the bottom shall be found 2 dragons, great and terrible, which are now sleeping, but which at night awake and fight and tear at each other. At their great struggle, all the ground shakes and trembles, and so cast down thy towers, which, therefore, never yet could find secure foundation." Well, the king was amazed at these words, truly, but he commanded the pool to be forthwith drained, just as told, and surely, at the bottom of it, they did presently discover those 2 dragons, fast asleep, just as Merlin had declared. But Vortigern sat upon the brink of the pool till night to see what else would happen. Then those 2 dragons, one of which was white, the other red, rose up and came near another, and began a sore fight, and cast forth fire with their breath. But the white dragon had the advantage, and chased the other to the end of the lake. And he, for grief at his flight, turned back upon his foe, and renewed the combat, and forced him to retire in turn. But in the end, the red dragon was defeated, and the white dragon disappeared, no man knew where. When the battle was done, the king desired Merlin to tell him what it all meant, whereat he, bursting into tears, cried out this prophecy, which first foretold the coming of King Arthur. Woe to the red dragon, which figureth the British nation, for his banishment cometh quickly. His lurking holes shall be seized by the white dragon, the Saxon, whom thou, our king, hast called the land. The mountains shall be levelled as the valleys, and the rivers of the valleys shall run blood. Cities shall be burned, churches laid in ruins, till at length the oppressed shall turn for a season and prevail against the strangers. For a boar of Cornwall shall arise and rend them, and trample their necks beneath his feet. The island shall be subject to his power, and he shall take the forests of Gaul. The house of Romulus shall dread him. All the world shall fear him, and his end no man should know. He shall be immortal in the mouths of the people, and his works shall be food to those that tell them. But as for thee, Vortigern, flee thou the sons of Constantine, for they shall burn thee in thy tower. For thine own ruin wast thou traitor to their father, and didst bring the Saxon heathens to the land. Aurelius and Uther are even now upon thee to revenge their father's murder, and the brood of the white dragon shall waste thy country, and shall lick thy blood. Find out some refuge, if thou wilt, but who may escape the doom of God. The king heard it all, and he trembled greatly, and convicted of his sins, said nothing in reply. Only he hasted the builders of his tower by day and night, and rested not until he had fled thereto. In the meantime, Aurelius the rightful king was hailed with joy by the Britons, who flocked to his standard, and prayed to be led against the Saxons. But he, till he had first killed Vortigern, would begin no other war. He marched therefore to Cambria, and came before the tower which the usurper had built. Then crying out to his knights, "Avenge ye on him who hath ruined Britain, and slain my father your king," he rushed with many thousands at the castle walls, but, being driven back again and yet again, at length he thought of fire, and ordered blazing brands to be cast into the building from all sides. These, finding soon a proper fuel, ceased not to rage, until, spreading to a mighty conflagration, they burned the tower down, and Vortigern within. Then did Aurelius turn his strength against Hengist and the Saxons, and, defeating them in many places, weakened their power for a long season, so that the land had peace. Anon the king, making journeys to and fro, restoring ruined churches and creating order, came to the monastery near Salisbury, where all those British knights lay buried who had been slain by the treachery of Hengist. For when in the former times Hengist had made a solemn truce with Vortigern to meet in peace and settle terms, whereby himself and all his Saxons should depart from Britain, the Saxon soldiers carried every one of them beneath his garments a long dagger, and at a given signal they fell upon the Britons and slew them, to the number of nearly 500. The sight of the place where the dead lay moved Aurelius to great sorrow, and he cast about in his mind how to make a worthy tomb over so many noble martyrs who had died there, all for their country. When he had in vain consulted many craftsmen and builders, he said by the advice of Archbishop for Merlin, and asked him what to do. Merlin was happy to help. "If you would honour the burying place of these men," said Merlin, "with an everlasting monument, send for the giants' dance, which is in Calarus, a mountain in Ireland. For there is a structure of stone there, which none of this age could raise without perfect knowledge of its arts. They are stones of vast size and wondrous nature, and if they can be placed here as they are, round this spot of the ground, well, they will stand forever. One of these words of Merlin, Aurelius burst into laughter mockingly, and said, "How is it possible to remove such vast stones from so great a distance? As if Britain also had no stones fit for the work?" Merlin bore it. "I pray for the king," he said, "to forbear vain laughter. For I have said merely what is true. For those stones are mystical, and have healing virtues. The giants of old brought them from the furthest coast of Africa, and placed them in Ireland, while they lived in that country. And their design was to make baths in them, for use in time of grievous illness. For if they washed the stones and put the sick into the water, it certainly healed them, as also it did them when they were wounded in battle. And there was no stone among them, but hath the same virtue still." When the Britons heard this, they were resolved to send for the stones, and to make war upon the people of Ireland if they offered to withhold them. So, when they had chosen Uther, the king's brother, for their chief, they set sail, to the number of 15,000 men, and came to Ireland. There, Gilumanius, the king, withstood them fiercely, and not till after a great battle could they approach the giants' dance, the sight of which filled them with joy and admiration. But when they sought to move the stones, the strength of all the army was in vain, until Merlin, who was laughing at their failures, contrived machines of wondrous cunning, which took them down with ease, and placed them in the ships. When they had brought the whole to Salisbury, Aurelius, with the crown upon his head, kept for 4 days the feast of Pentecost with royal pomp. And in the midst of all the clergy and the people, Merlin raised up the stones, and set them round the sepulchre of the knights and barons, as they stood in the mountains of Ireland. Then was the monument called Stonehenge, and stands, as all men know, upon the plain of Salisbury to this very day. Soon after there it befell Aurelius was slain by poison at Winchester, and was himself buried within the giant's dance. At the same time came forth a comet of amazing size and brightness, darting out a beam, at the end whereof was a cloud of fire shaped like a dragon, and whose mouth went out 2 rays, one stretching over Gaul, and the other ending in 7 lesser rays over the Irish Sea. At the appearance of this star, a great dread fell upon the people, and Uther, marching into Cambria against the son of Vortigern, himself was very troubled to learn what it might mean. And then Merlin, being called before them, cried with a loud voice, "O mighty loss, O stricken Britain! Alas, the great prince is gone from us. Aurelius Ambrosius is dead, whose death will also be ours also, unless God help us. Haste, therefore, noble Uther, to destroy the enemy. The victory shall be thine, and thou shalt be king of all Britain. For the star with the fiery dragon signifies thyself, and thy ray over Gaul portends that thou shalt have a son, most mighty, whom all those kingdoms shall obey which the ray covers." Thus, for a second time, did Merlin foretell the coming of King Arthur. And Uther, when he was made king, remembered Merlin's words, and caused 2 dragons to be made in gold, in likeness of the dragon he had seen in the star. One of these he gave to Winchester Cathedral, and he had the other carried into all of the wars before him, whence he was ever after called Uther Pendragon, or the Dragon's Head. Now, when Uther Pendragon had passed through all the land and settled it, and even voyaged into all the countries of the Scots, and tamed the fierceness of that rebellious people, he came to London, and ministered justice there. And it befell, at a certain great banquet and high feast which the king made at Eastertide, there came, with many other earls and barons, Gorlois, the Duke of Cornwall, and his wife Igerna, who was the most beautiful in all of Britain. Therefore, Gorlois being slain in battle, Uther determined to make Igerna his own wife. But in order to do this, and enable him to come to her, for she was shut up in the castle of Tintagel, on the furthest coast of Cornwall, the king sent for Merlin to take counsel with him, and to pray for his help. This, therefore, Merlin promised him on one condition, namely, that the king should give him up on the first son born of their marriage. For Merlin by his art foreknew that this firstborn shall be the long-wished prince, King Arthur. When Uther, therefore, was at length happily wedded, Merlin came to the castle on a certain day, and said, Sir, thou must now provide thee for the nourishing of thy child. And the king, nothing doubting, said, Be it as thou wilt. I know a lord in this land, said Merlin, who is a man both true and faithful. Let him have the nourishing of the child. His name is Sir Ector, and he hath fair possessions in both England and Wales. When, therefore, the child is born, let him be delivered unto me, unchristened, at yonder postern gate, and I will bestow him in the good care of this great knight. And so when the child was born, the king bid 2 knights and 2 ladies to take it, bound in rich cloth of gold, and deliver it to a poor man, whom they should discover at the postern gate. And the child being delivered thus to Merlin, who himself took the guise of a poor man, was carried by him to a holy priest, and christened by the name of Arthur, and was then taken to Sir Ector's house, and nourished at Sir Ector's wife's own breast. And in the same house he remained privily for many years, no man knowing where he was, save Merlin and the king himself. Anon it befell that the king was seized by a lingering distemper, and the Saxon heathens, taking their occasion, came back over from the sea and swarmed upon the land, wasting it with fire and sword. When Uther heard thereof, he fell into a great rage, that his weakness could even bear, and he commanded all his nobles to come before him, that he might upbraid them for their cowardice. And when he had sharply and hotly rebuked them, he swore that he himself, nigh unto death although he lay, would lead them forth against the enemy. Then, causing a horse litter to be made, in which he might be carried, for he was too faint and weak to ride, he went up with all his army, swiftly against the Saxons. But they, when they heard that Uther was coming in a litter, disdained to fight him, saying it would be a shame for brave men to fight with one half dead. So they retired into their city, and, as it were in scorn of danger, left the gates wide open. But Uther straightway commanding his men to assault the town, they did so without loss of time, and had already reached the gates when the Saxons, repenting too late of their pride, rushed to the defence. The battle raged through the night, and was begun again the next day. But at last their leaders, Octa and Ailsa, being slain, the Saxons turned their backs and fled, leaving the Britons a full triumph. The king at this felt so great joy that whereas, because he could scarce himself raise without help, he now sat upright in his litter by himself and said with a laughing and merry face, "They called me the half-dead king, and so indeed I was. But victory to me half-dead is better than defeat in the best of health. For die with honour is far better than to live disgraced." But the Saxons, although thus defeated, were still ready for war. Uther would have pursued them, but his illness had by now so grown that his knights and barons kept him from the adventure, whereat the enemy took courage and left nothing undone to destroy land, until, descending to the vilest treachery, they resolved to kill the king by poison. To this end, as he lay sick at Verulam, they sent and poisoned stealthily a spring of clear water, whence he was wont to drink daily. And so, on the very next day, he was taken with the pains of death, as were also 100 others after him, before the villainy was discovered, and heaps of earth thrown over the well. The knights and barons, full of sorrow, now took counsel together, and came to Merlin for his help to learn the king's will before he died, for he was, by this time, speechless. "Sirs, there is no remedy," said Merlin, "and God's will simply must be done. But be you all tomorrow before him, for God will make him speak before he dies." So, upon the morrow, all the barons, with Merlin, stood round the bedside of the king, and Merlin said aloud to Uther, "Lord, shall thy son Arthur be the king of all this realm after thy days?" And then Uther Pendragon turned him about and said, in the hearing of all of them around, "God's blessing and mine be upon him. I bid him pray for my soul, and also that he claim my crown, or forfeit all my blessing." And with those words, Uther died. Then came together all the bishops and the clergy, and great multitudes of people, and bewailed the king, and carrying his body to the convent of Ambrosius, they buried it close by his brother's grave, within the giant's dance. Chapter 2. The crowning of Arthur and the sword Excalibur. Now Arthur the prince at all this time had been nourished in Sir Ector's house as his own son, and was fair and tall and comely, being the age of 15 years, great in strength, gentle in manner, and accomplished in all exercises proper for the training of a knight. But as yet he knew not of his father, for Merlin had so dealt that none save Uther and himself knew aught about him. Wherefore it befell that many of the knights and barons who heard King Uther speak before his death and call his son Arthur his successor were in great amazement. Some doubted, and others were displeased. Anon the chief of the lords and princes set forth, each to his own land, and raising armed men and multitude of followers, determined every one to gain the crown for himself. For they said in their hearts, if there be any such a son at all, as he of whom this wizard was forced the king to speak, who are we that a beardless boy should have rule over us? So the land stood long in the greatest of peril, for every lord and baron sought but his own advantage, and the Saxons, growing ever more adventurous, wasted and overran the towns and villages of every part. Then went Merlin to Brice, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and advised him all the required earls and barons of the realms, and all knights and gentlemen at arms to come to him at London before Christmas, under pain of cursing, that they might learn the will of heaven, who should be king. This, therefore, the Archbishop did, and upon Christmas Eve were met together in London all the greatest princes, lords, and barons, and long before the day they prayed in St. Paul's Church, and the Archbishop besought heaven for a sign who should be the lawful king of the realm. And as they prayed, there was seen in the churchyard, set straight before the doorways of the church, a huge square stone having a naked sword stuck out in the midst of it, and on the sword was written in letters of gold, "Whoso pulleth the sword from this stone is born the rightful King of England." At this, all the people wondered greatly, and when Mass was over, the nobles, knights, and princes ran out eagerly from the church to see the stone and the sword, and a law was forthwith made that whoso should pull the sword from the stone shall be acknowledged straightway the King of Britain. Of course, then many knights and barons pulled at the sword with all their might, and some of them tried many times, but none of them could move it. When all had tried in vain, the Archbishop declared the man whom heaven had chosen was not yet there. But God, he said, will doubtless make him known before many days have passed. So 10 knights were chosen, being men of high renown, to watch and keep the sword. And there was proclamation made through all the land that whosoever would have leave and liberty to try to pull it from the stone. But though great multitudes of people came, both gentle and simple, for many days no man could ever move the sword a hair's breadth from its place. Now, at the New Year's Eve, a great tournament was to be held in London, which the Archbishop had devised to keep together lords and commons, lest they should grow estranged in the troublous and unsettling times. To which the tournament there came, with many other knights, Sir Ector, Arthur's foster father, who had great possessions near to London, and with him came his son Sir Key, but recently made a knight, to take his part in jousting, and young Arthur also to witness all the sports and fighting and revelry. But as they rode towards the jousts, Sir Key found suddenly that he was without sword, for he had left it at his father's house, and turning to young Arthur, he prayed him ride back and fetch it for him. "I will, with a good will," said Arthur, and rode back fast after the sword. When he came to the house, he found it locked and empty, for all were gone to see the tournament. Whereat, being angry and impatient, he said within himself, "I will ride to the churchyard, and take with me that sword that sticketh in the stone, for my brother shall not go without his sword this day." So he rode, and came to the churchyard, and alighting from his horse, he tied him to the gate, and went to the pavilion, which was pitched near the stone, wherein abode the 10 knights who watched and kept it. But he found no knights there, for all were gone to see the jousting. When he took the sword by its handle, it lightly and fiercely pulled out of the stone, and took his horse and rode until he came to Sir Kay and delivered him the sword. But as soon as Sir Kay saw it, he knew well it was the sword in the stone, and riding swiftly to his father, he cried out, "Lo, here, sir, is the sword of the stone, wherefore it is I must be king of all this land." When Sir Ector saw the sword, he turned back straight with Arthur and Sir Kay, and came to the churchyard, and there alighting, they all went, the three of them, into the church, and Sir Kay was sworn to tell the truth about how he came by the sword. It was there that he confessed that his brother Arthur had brought it to him, whereat Sir Ector, turning to young Arthur, asked him, "How gottest thou the sword?" "Sir," he said, "I will tell you. When I went home to fetch my brother's sword, I found no one to deliver it to me, for all were abroad to the jousts, you see. Yet was I loth to leave my brother swordless, and while bethinking me of this one, I came hither eagerly to fetch it for him, and pulled it out the stone, without any great pain either." Then said Sir Ector, much amazed and looking steadfastly on Arthur, "If this indeed be thus, it is thou who shalt be king of all this land, and God will have it so, for none but he who should be the rightful lord of Britain might ever draw this sword from that stone. But let me now, with thine own eyes, see thee put the sword back into its place, and draw it forth again." "That is no mastery," said Arthur, and straightway set it in the stone. And then Sir Ector pulled at it himself, and after him Sir Kay, both with all their might, but both all in vain, until Arthur, reaching forth his hand and grasping at the pummel, pulled it out easily, and right at once, with no great effort. Then fell Sir Ector down upon his knees, upon the ground before the young Arthur, and Sir Kay also with him, and straightway did him homage as their sovereign lord. But Arthur cried aloud, "Alas, mine own dear father and my brother, why kneel ye thus to me?" "Nay, my lord Arthur," answered then Sir Ector, "we are of no blood kinship with thee, and little though I thought how high thy kin might be, yet wast thou never more than the foster child of mine." And then he told him all he knew before his infancy, and how a stranger had delivered him with a great sum of gold into his hands to be brought up and nourished as his own born child, and then had disappeared. But when young Arthur heard it, he fell upon Sir Ector and wept, and made a great lamentation. "For now," he said, "I have in one day lost my father, and my mother, and my brother." "Sir," said Sir Ector presently, "when thou shalt be made king, be good and gracious unto me." "If not," said Arthur, "I were no true man's son at all, for thou art he in all the world to whom I own the most, and my good lady and mother, thy wife, hath ever kept me fostered as though I were her own. So if it be God's will that I be king hereafter, as thou sayest, desire of me whatever thing thou wilt, and I will do it, and God forbid that I shall fail thee in this regard." "But I will pray," replied Sir Ector, "that thou wilt make my son, Sir Kay, thy foster brother, seneschal of all the lands." "That shall he be," said Arthur, "and never shall another hold that office, save thy son, while he and I do live." Anon they left the church and went to the archbishop to tell him that the sword had been achieved. And when he saw that the sword in Arthur's hand, he set a day and summoned all the princes, knights, and barons to meet again at St. Paul's Church, and see the will of heaven signified. So when they came together, the sword was put back on the stone, and all tried, from the greatest to the least, to move it, but there before them, all not one could take it, save only the great King Arthur. But then befell a great confusion and a dispute, for some cried out that it was the will of heaven, and long live King Arthur. But many more were full of wrath, and said, What? Would you give the ancient sceptre of this land to a boy born to none know how? And the contention growing greatly, till nothing could be done to pacify their rage. The meeting was at length broken up by the archbishop, and adjourned until Candlemas, when all should meet again. But when Candlemas had come, Arthur alone pulled forth the sword again, though more than ever came to win it, and the barons, sorely vexed and angry, put it in delay till Easter. But as he had sped before so, as did at Easter, and the barons yet once more contrived delays until Pentecost. But now the archbishop, fully seeing the will of God, called together by Merlin's council a band of knights and gentlemen at arms, and set them about Arthur to keep him safely until the feast of Pentecost. And when the feast of Arthur still again alone prevailed to move the sword, the people at all at once, with one accord, cried out, Long live King Arthur! We will have no more delay, nor any other king, for so it is God's will, and we will slay whosoever resisteth him and Arthur. And wherewithal they kneeled down all at once, and cried for Arthur's grace and pardon, that they had so long delayed him from his crown. Then he full sweetly and majestically pardoned them all, and taking in his hand the sword, he offered it upon the high altar of the church. Anon was he solemnly knighted with great pomp by the most famous knight there present, and the crown was placed upon his head, and, having taken oath to all the people's lords and commons to be true king and deal in justice unto his life's end, he received homage and service from the barons who held the lands and castles from the crown. Then he made Sir Key High Steward of England, and Sir Baedwin of Britain Constable, and Sir Ulfius Chamberlain. And after this, with all his court and a great retinue of knights and armoured upon men, he journeyed into Wales, and was crowned again in the old city of Caerleon upon Usk. Meanwhile, those knights and barons who had so long delayed him from the crown met together, and went up to the coronation feast at Caerleon, as if to do him homage, and there they ate and drank such things as were set before them at the royal banquet, sitting with the others in the great hall. But when after the banquet of Arthur began, according to the ancient royal custom to bestow great boons and fiefs on whom he could, they all with one accord rose up and scornfully refused his gifts, crying that they would take nothing from a beardless boy come of low or unknown birth, but would instead give him good gifts of hard sword strokes between the neck and shoulders, whereat arose a deadly tumult in the hall, and every man there made ready to fight. But Arthur leapt up as a flame of fire against them, and all his knights and barons, drawing their swords, rushed after him. Upon them began a full sore of battle, and presently the king's party prevailed, and drove the rebels from the hall and the city, closing the gates up behind them. And King Arthur brake his sword upon them in his eagerness and rage. But amongst them were 6 kings of great renown and might, who more than all raged against Arthur, and determined to destroy him, namely King Lot, Nantos, Urien, Carados, Eder, and Anguisant. These 6, therefore, joining their armies together, laid close siege to the city of Caerleon, wherefrom King Arthur had so shamefully driven them. After 15 days, Merlin came suddenly into their camp and asked them what this treason meant. Then he declared to them that Arthur was no base adventurer, but King Uther's son himself, whom they were bound to serve and honour, even though heaven had not vouchsafed the wondrous miracle of the sword. Some of the kings, when they heard Merlin speak, thus marvelled and believed him. But others, as King Lot, laughed at him, and his words to scorn, and mocked him as a conjurer and wizard. But it was agreed with Merlin that Arthur should come forth and speak with the kings himself. So he went forth to them at the city gate, and with him the archbishop and Merlin, and Sir Key and Sir Brastias, and a great company of others. And he spared them not in his speech, but spoke to them as a king and chieftain, telling them plainly that he would make them all bow to him if he lived, unless they chose to do him homage there and then. And so they parted in great wrath, and each side armed in haste. "What will you do?" said Merlin to the kings. "Ye had best hold your hands, for were ye 10 times as many, you would not prevail." "Shall we be afraid of a dream reader?" quoth King Lot in scorn. With that Merlin vanished away, and came to King Arthur. Then Arthur said unto Merlin, "I have need now of a sword that shall chastise these rebels terribly." "Come with me," said Merlin, "for hard by there is a sword that I can gain for thee." So they rode out that night till they came to a fair and broad lake, and in the midst of it King Arthur saw an arm thrust up, clothed in white samite, and holding a great sword in the hand. "Lo, yonder is the sword I speak of," said Merlin. Then they saw a damsel floating on the lake in the moonlight. "What damsel is that?" said the king. "The lady of the lake," said Merlin, "for upon this lake there is a rock, and on the rock a noble palace, where she abideth. And she will come towards thee presently, when thou shalt ask her courteously for the sword." Therewith the damsel came to King Arthur and saluted him, and he saluted her, and said, "Lady, what sword is that the arm holdeth above the water? I would that if it were mine, for I have no sword." "Sir King," said the lady of the lake, "that sword is mine, and if thou wilt give me in return a gift whenever I shall ask of thee, then thou shalt have it." "By my faith," said Arthur, "I will give thee any gift that thou shalt ask." "Well," said the damsel, "go into yonder barge and row thyself unto the sword, and take it, and scabbard with thee, and I will ask my gift of thee when I see my time." So Arthur and Merlin alighted, and tied their horses to 2 trees, and went into the barge, and when they came to the sword that the hand held, King Arthur took it by the handle and bore it with him, and the arm and hand went down under the water, and so they came back to land, and rode again to Caerleon. On the morrow Merlin bade King Arthur set fiercely upon the enemy, and in the meanwhile 300 good knights went over to Arthur from the rebels' side. Then at the spring of day, when they had scarce left their tents, he fell upon them with might and main, and Sir Baedwain, Sir Guy, and Sir Brastias slew on the right and on the left marvellously, and ever in the thickest of the fight King Arthur raged like a young lion, and laid on with his sword, and did wondrous deeds of arms, to the joy and admiration of all the knights and barons that beheld him. Then King Lot, King Carados, and the King of the 100 Knights, who was also with them, going round to the rear, set upon Arthur fiercely from behind, but Arthur, turning to his knights, fought ever in the foremost press until his horse was slain beneath him. At that King Lot rode furiously at him, and smote him down, but rising straightway, and being set again on horseback, he drew his sword Excalibur that he had gained by Merlin from the Lady of the Lake, which shining brightly as the light of 30 torches dazzled the eyes of his enemies, and therewith falling on them afresh all his knights, he drove them back, and slew them in great number. And Merlin by his arts scattered among them fire and pitchy smoke, so that they broke and fled. Then all the common people of Caerleon, seeing them give way, rose up with one accord, and rushed at them with clubs and staves, and chased them far and wide, slaying many great knights and lords, and the remainder of them fled, and were seen no more. Thus won King Arthur his first battle, and his enemies were put to shame. But the 6 kings, though sorely routed, prepared for a new war, and joining themselves to 5 others, swore together that, whether for weal or woe, they would keep steadfast alliance till they had destroyed King Arthur. Then with a host of 50,000 men-at-arms on horseback and 10,000 on foot, they were soon ready, and sent forth their 4 riders, and drew from the northern country towards King Arthur to the castle of Bedgrain. But he by Merlin's counsel had sent oversea to King Ban of Benwick and King Bors of Gaul, praying them to come and help them in his wars, and promising to help them in return against King Claudas their foe, to which these kings made the answer that they would joyfully fulfill his wish. And shortly after they came to London with 300 knights, well arrayed for both peace and war, leaving behind them a great many on the side of the sea, till they had consulted with King Arthur and his ministers on how they might best dispose of it. And Merlin, being asked for his advice and help, agreed to go himself and fetch it over the sea to England, which in one night he did, and brought with him 10,000 horsemen, and led them northward privately to the forest of Bedgrain, and there lodged them in a valley secretly. Then by the counsel of Merlin, when they knew which way the 11 kings would ride and sleep, King Arthur with the kings Ban and Bors made themselves ready for the army for the fight, having yet but 30,000 men, counting the 10,000 who had come from Gaul. Now shall ye do my advice, said Merlin, I would that King Ban and King Bors, with all their fellowship of 10,000 men, were to lead an ambush in this wood ere daylight, and stir not therefrom until the battle hath been long waged. And though, Lord Arthur, at the spring of day, draw forth thine army before the enemy, and dress the battle, so that they may at once see all thy host, for they will be more rash and hardy when they see you have but 20,000 men. To this the knights and the barons heartily consented. It was done as Merlin had devised. So, on the morrow, when all the hosts beheld each other, the host of the north was greatly cheered to find so few led out against them. Then King Arthur gave the command to Sir Ulfius and Sir Brastias to take 3,000 men at arms and to open the battle. They therefore, setting fiercely upon the enemy, slew them on the right hand and on the left, till it was a wonder to see their slaughter. When the 11 kings beheld so small a band doing such mighty deeds of arms, they were ashamed, and charged them fiercely in return. Then was Sir Ulfius's horse slain beneath him, but he fought so well and marvellously on foot against Duke Eustace and Clarence, who set upon him grievously, till Sir Brastias, seeing his great peril, pricked towards them swiftly, and so smote the Duke with his spear that the horse and the man fell down and rolled over. Whereat King Clarence turned upon Sir Brastias, and rushing furiously together, they unhorsed the other, and fell upon the ground, and there lay a long time stunned, their horses' knees being cut to the bone. Then came Sir Kay, the seneschal, with 6 companions, and did wondrously, till the 11 kings went out against them, and overthrew Sir Griflet and Sir Lucas the butler. And when Sir Kay saw Sir Griflet unhorsed and on foot, he rode against King Nanters hotly, and smote him down, and led his horse to Griflet, and horsed him again. With the same spear did Sir Kay smite down King Lot, and wounded him full sore. But, seeing that, the King of the 100 Knights rushed at Sir Kay, and overthrew him in return, and took his horse and gave it to King Lot. And when Sir Griflet saw Sir Kay's mischance, he set his spear in rest, and riding at a mighty man-at-arms, he cast him down headlong, and caught his horse, and led it straightway to Sir Kay. By now the battle was growing perilous and hard, and both sides fought with rage and fury. Ulfius and Brastias were both afoot and in great danger of their death, and foully stained and trampled under horses' feet. Then Arthur, putting spurs to his horse, rushed forward like a lion into the midst of all the melee, and, singling out of King Cradlemount of North Wales, smote him through the left side and overthrew him. Taking his horse by the rein, he brought it to Sir Ulfius in haste, and said, "Take this horse, old friend, for thou hast need of one, and charge by side of me." And even as he spoke, he saw Sir Ector, Sir Kay's father, smitten to the earth by the King of the 100 Knights, and his horse taken to King Cradlemont. But when Arthur saw him ride upon Sir Ector's horse, his wrath was very great, and with all his sword he smote King Cradlemont upon the helm, and shore off the 4th part thereof, and of the shield, and drove the sword onward to the horse's neck, and slew the horse, and hurled the king upon the ground. And now the battle waxed so great and furious, that all the noise and sound thereof rang out by the water and by wood, So that Kings Ban and Bors, with all their knights and men-at-arms in ambush, hearing the tumult and cries, trembled and shook for eagerness, and scarce could stay in secret, but made them ready for the fray and dressed their shields and harness. But when King Arthur saw the fury of the enemy, he raged like a mad lion, and stirred and drove his horse now here, now there, to the right hand, to the left hand, and stayed not on his wrath, until he had slain full 20 knights. He wounded also King Lot so sorely in the shoulder that he had to leave the field, and in great pain cried out to the other knights, "Do ye as I devise, or we shall be destroyed." I, with the King of the 100 Knights, King Anguison, King Eder, and the Duke of Cambine, will take 15,000 men and make a circuit, meanwhile that ye do not hold the battle with 12,000. Then coming suddenly, we will fall fiercely upon them from behind, and put them to rout, but else shall we never stand against them. So Lot and 4 kings departed with their party to one side, and the 6 other kings dressed their ranks against Arthur and fought long and stoutly. But now Kings Ban and Bors, with all their army fresh and eager, broke from their ambush, and met face to face with the 5 knights and their host as they came round behind, and began a frantic struggle with the breaking of spears and clashing of swords and slaying of men and horses. King Lot, espying the midst of King Bors, cried out in great dismay, "Our Lady now defend us from our death and fearful wounds. Our peril grows great, for yonder cometh one of the worshipfullest kings and best knights in the world." "Who is he?" said the King of the 100 Knights. "It is King Bors of Gaul," replied King Lot, "and much I marvel how he had came with all his host to this land without our knowledge." King Carados cried out, "Ah, I will encounter with this king if ye will rescue me when there is need." "Ride on," they said. And so King Carados and all his host rode swiftly and softly until they came within a bow-shot range of King Bors, and then both hosts, spurring their horses to the greatest swiftness, rushed upon each other, and King Bors encountered in the onset with a knight, and struck him through with a spear, so that he fell dead upon the earth. Then drawing his sword, he did such mighty feats of arms that all who saw him gazed with wonder. King Ban came forth also with the field of his knights, and added yet even more fury, more sound, more slaughter, till at length both hosts of the 11 knights began to quake, and drawing all together into one body, they prepared to meet the worst, while a great multitude already fled. Then said King Lot, "Lords, we must take yet other means, or worse loss still awaits us. See not what people have lost in waiting on the footmen, and that it cost 10 horsemen to save one of them. Therefore it is my counsel to put away our footmen from us, for it is almost night, and King Arthur will not stay to slaughter them. So they can save their lives in this great wood hard by. Then let us gather into one band all the horsemen that remain, and whoso breaketh rank or leaveth us, let him be straightway slain by him that seeth him. For it is better that we slay a coward than through a coward be all slain. How say ye?" said King Lot. "Answer me, all ye kings." "It is well said," replied them all. And swearing that they would never fail each other, they mended and set right their armour and shields, and took new spears and set them steadfastly against their thighs, waiting and so stood still as a clump of trees stands upon the plain, and no assaults could shake them. They held so hard together, which when King Arthur saw, he marvelled greatly, and was very wroth. Yet, he cried, I may not blame them. By my faith, for they do as brave men ought to do, and are best fighting men and knights of prowess that I had ever saw or heard tell of. And so said also Kings Ban and Bors, and praised them greatly for their noble chivalry. But now came 40 noble knights out of King Arthur's host, and prayed that he would suffer them to break the enemy. And when they were allowed, they rode forth with their spears upon their thighs, and spurred their horses to the hottest. Then the 11 kings, with a party of their knights, rushed with set spears as fast and mighty to meet them. And when they were encountered, all the crash and splinter of their spears and armour rang with a mighty din, and so fierce and bloody was the onset in that day, that all that had been there had been no such cruel press and rage and smiting. And at the same moment rode fiercely into the thickest struggle King Arthur and Kings Ban and Bors. They slew downright on both hands, right and left, until their horses went in blood up to the fetlocks. And while their slaughter and noise and the shouting were at the greatest, suddenly there came, down through the battle, Merlin the wizard, upon a great black horse, and riding to King Arthur he cried aloud, Alas, my lord, will ye have never done? Of 60,000 ye have left but 15,000 men alive. Is it not time to stay this killing? For God is ill pleased that ye have never ended, and yonder kings shall not be altogether overthrown this time. But if ye fall upon them any more, the fortune of this day will turn and go to them. Withdraw, my lord, therefore to thy lodging, and then I'll take thy rest. For today thou hast won a great victory, and overcome the noblest chivalry in the world. And now for many years those kings shall not disturb thee. Therefore I tell you, fear them no more, for they are so sorely beaten, and have nothing left but their honour. Why should thou slay them to take that? Then said King Arthur, You say it well, and I will take their counsel. With that he cried out for the battle to cease, and sent forth heralds through the field to stay more fighting. And gathering all the spoil, he gave it not amongst his own host, but to Kings Ban and Bors, and all their knights and men-at-arms, that he might treat them with the greater courtesy as strangers. Then Merlin took his leave of Arthur and the 2 other kings, and went to see his master, Blaise, a holy hermit, dwelling in Northumberland, who had nourished him all through his youth. And Blaise was passing glad to see him, for there was no great love between them. And Merlin told him how King Arthur had sped in the battle, and how it had ended, and told him the names of every king and knight of worship who was there. So Blaise wrote down the battle, word for word, just as Merlin had told him, and in the same way, ever after, all the battles of King Arthur's days, Merlin caused Blaise, his master, to record. Okay, I hope you liked that one. We have reached the end of part 1 of our Arthurian legends. So I'm going to thank my top tier patrons and supporters: Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizarbo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuronerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, and JR. Thank you very much for listening, and if you've enjoyed it, well, I suppose I'll see you in part 2. But for now, good night. Lots of love to you all.